Hello, welcome to Spacemen Pod. I'm Ian Edmund.
And I'm Mark Lassells.
And today we're going to be having the second part of our chat with Mark Refoy. First part last time was all about the bands that he was in prior to joining Spacemen 3. 6 of them I think we counted there. I think I might have even discovered another one since. We'll have to ask him about that sometime soon. But yes, today is going to be the one talk about Spacemen 3 and Spiritualized. Before that, let's just do a few little things that we've noticed lately. Something which should really have mentioned before. Our friend Greg Jarvis, who's we chatted to on the second podcast, the same one that we did lots of talking about transparent radiation, mentioned to me afterwards that he was surprised that hadn't taken the chance to mention something that Jason's been involved with, which was Jason and John Coxon did an event playing Red Crayola stuff. Well, inspired by, I think, more than anything. The event was subsequently released on an album called Jay Spaceman and Jay Coxon Play the Red Crayola Live 1967. There's a link that I'll stick on the part of my site for the podcast where you can still order that from. It's a vinyl only release. And also they have put up a video of the performance as well. I think the one on the album was from the rehearsals rather than the one that you can actually see live. That's a bit of an experimental thing. And my apologies to Greg Jarvis, who correctly pointed this out. It would have been an ideal thing to do. I just completely forgot. And then I forgot to do it last time as well. So finally, I hope that gets some interest. I mean, this is very experimental stuff. This is off the beaten track. Yeah. For those of you who are into Jason's more song-based stuff, probably not the thing to rush out and buy. But they've done a few releases like this before, and I know they've got their fans as well. And you can have a look at that video of them doing the performance.
And available on vinyl, I think you said.
Yes, I think it is a vinyl only release. There still seem to be some available, even though I think it was a bit of a limited one. So there's one to check out. Something else I noticed was that Synthetic Dreams podcast have just released an episode where they interview Pete Kember, mostly about his recent work, the Sonic Boom album from last year and the remix album from a month or so ago. That's really interesting. I don't want to give too much away of what they talk about because you should go and listen to it. But in particular, I thought it was really interesting, Pete talking about doing the remix album in terms of what he was aiming for, in terms of a feel, and why he therefore decided to leave some of the tracks from the album off. It wasn't just a random whatever he felt like remixing on the day. There was a plan behind it, really. So some things are specifically included and worked on in a particular way, and other things were specifically left out for a good reason. Also talks about his friendship with Delia Derbyshire as well. It was a good listen. So again, there'll be a link to that on the page on the site for the podcast. Cheval Sombre has put out another album, which is the second one this year. So this is called Days Go By, and it's been produced and mixed by Pete Kember. This is only 3 months after his previous one, Time Waits for No One. I believe that the gap between these albums and the one before that was something like 9 years. I really need to catch up on all this. It's not someone whose work I'm particularly aware of, although I've been listening to a track from the new album that was on the Sonic Cathedral, who put the albums out website earlier, and it does sound lovely. Again, link to the Sonic Cathedral website where you can order that from. Sonic Cathedral have been doing an awful lot of interesting stuff for many years now. They seem to be the main people who put out Andy Bell from Rides records these days, and he's had some stuff out quite recently too from them, and they're just well worth investigating in general. And Will Carruthers did a little online event, not really a gig as such, although he did play some songs, but chat as well, or rambling as he says. Apologies, he said, for the rambling. I think that was as much an interesting part of it as anything else. Now, it was really for his Patreon supporters. He has a Patreon which starts at a really quite inexpensive level, and it's worth checking that out. If you want to have a little try before you buy, then he posted a couple of minutes of him performing one of the songs on his Twitter feed. So I'll put a link to that tweet of his where you can see a bit of the performance, and there are links in that if you want to investigate any more of it. Okay, well, let's get on to the second part of our interview with Mark Refoy. Now, last time we did this part of the interview and the previous one all in one go. So there was no natural cut-off point. Last time we sort of stopped, sudden chop at the end of the pre-Spacemen 3 stuff. And in a similar way, this one has a very sudden beginning in that respect. So if you can just imagine that you're already in the middle of a nice, relaxed conversation, here we go, asking Mark about his time in Spacemen 3 and in Spiritualized. You went down to that gig to see Spacemen 3 at Waterman's in May '89.
That's right, yeah.
When it seemed that everyone knew what was going to happen except for you, smiling away in the background. So what happened when you got there?
I met Johnny at first, and it's way out. Where is it, Brentford?
Yeah,
it's near the Thames, isn't it? Is it
West London, down the M4 or the A4. Yeah. You go down that way, there's lots of tower blocks. I used to have some friends live down there.
Yeah, I met Johnny first, and he said, "Oh, I think Pete wants to have a word with you." I was like, "Oh, why?" And he went, "I don't know, just wants to have a word with you." And then I met Pete, and Pete had kind of like, he'd grown in stature, if you know what I mean. Not physically, but his presence had. I mean, by this time they were like having features in the Melody Maker and Enemy and all that sort of thing. They were bona fide, proper band, you know. And Pete saw me and he went, "All right, Mark, any chance I could have a word?" And I went, yeah, all right, yeah. And so we went to this small changing room or something, and we were sitting down, and he went, "Yeah, I'd like to. We want to expand our sound in Spacemen 3, so we're thinking of getting another guitar player in. Are you up for it?" And I'm, "You are?" I said, "Yeah, take some time to think about it and let me know." Right? No, I can tell you now, mate. I'll do it. And he laughed and he went, "Okay, great. Yeah, I'll see you later." So I was on my own, and I was walking around in a fucking daze, just thinking, what the fuck? What do they want me? You know, because as much as I loved them, I didn't really fit the part, you know, physically. You know, I had this massive curly hair and not that I would try and ape their appearance, but I thought, oh, I won't fit in with this, you know. But I just ignored all that, and I didn't see them for about another hour or so, and I started to think, did I imagine that? You know, or was he taking the piss? And but no, sure enough, he meant it.
Wow. Do you think it likely that if they'd been talking about getting another guitarist in, then it might have been Johnny returning the favour and making the suggestion to them?
Yeah, it's quite possible. Johnny has said that when they were on that European tour, Pete was sounding them out, saying, you know, "Do you think we should get another guitarist in to beef our sound up?" And Johnny went, "Well, how about Mark Refoy?" And according to Johnny, they all went, "Yeah, why not?"
But despite the fact that you'd been offered that then and accepted on the spot, they'd already got a series of gigs lined up, and it was too late to. I don't know whether you were busy or they couldn't make the logistics work straight away.
Yeah, it was that. Yeah,
it wasn't until it got around to July that this finally happened. Yeah. And so by that point, they were warming up for what was their biggest solo outdoor gig. Well, they had one lined up at Town and Country first.
Town and Country, yeah.
But before that, I don't know if it was just to reward the people in rugby or whether it was to give you a chance to have an experience. I think. Before that, they did that gig at the Imperial.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were there the last time they played the Imperial, because that would have been probably not long after you first knew who they were. But they played there back on Valentine's Day in 1986, where they were famously booed off by bikers who ran the pub ran that night. There was
I wasn't there. I heard about it. Yeah,
that's one of the ones we got a recording of where they stop and take a vote as to whether they should carry on. They won the vote. They won the vote, but the bikers still ejected them after another song anyway. This one, I gather, was a bit of a different story, and it was a bit more of a homecoming celebration, really. I mean, they had, in that particular level, in that sort of NME melody maker type band, they were a big deal.
Oh, yeah, definitely, yeah.
Just on the eve of playing a massive London gig.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's no recording that we know of that Imperial gig.
No.
So, do you remember anything about it?
I was nervous as hell. But we'd been rehearsing in the Imp for the gig at the Imperial. And Pete said to me, oh, I'll tell you what, Mark, it was suggested to us that the only reason we've got you in the band is because I want to kick Jason out and I want to get you to replace Jason. He said this in front of everybody. And I just went, no way. And I don't know to this day whether he was sounding me out about that or whether he was just saying, what a preposterous notion, you know. But I remember when we were rehearsing and he said, how are you feeling, Mark? I said, oh, I'm pretty nervous, actually. But, you know, I'll be all right. And he went, don't worry, mate. You'll be rocking with your cock out. And then halfway through the gig at the Town and Country Club, because I told my mates about that, and they came to the Town and Country gig, and in between one of the songs, it was Tim Crisp, actually. He said, Marky, get your cock out.
I mean, I'm guessing that gig at the Town and Country was probably the biggest thing that Spacemen 3 had played up to that point, and therefore I imagine the biggest stage that you've been on.
Oh, yeah, by far, yeah, definitely.
I gather it was an incredibly hot night as well.
Yeah, I'll never forget the heat. It was just overwhelming, yeah. So, just sweat just dripping down when I was playing. What a night. I think we did Revolution twice.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it was quite common for it to be played twice by that point.
Oh,
well, a little bit of a break after that, but about a month later, it was time for Reading Festival. And again, there was another warm-up gig for that as well at Subterranea.
Subterranea, yeah.
Someone's videoed that one, so we were able to see it. Not the best recording, unfortunately. Yeah. It's a little bit like a blue screen a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But from the angle they're at, that's where we can see you quite well throughout a lot of that one.
Mm.
I mean, Subterranea is not exactly a town and country venue, but it's still moderate.
Yeah, it was
nice warm up,
decent enough. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great little warm up venue for a gig like Reading or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and then a couple of days later, the only time that I saw Spacemen 3.
Oh yeah.
Not that I knew who you were at the time, but yeah,
in the distance,
middle of the afternoon on a rainy day. Not really the natural home of Spacemen 3, I would say, really.
You say it's not the natural home of Spacemen 3, but I'd say that wherever Spacemen 3 pitch their tent, that would be their natural home, wherever, you know.
Well, that's fair enough. Or do you remember of that day?
John Peel was on the side of the stage, if I remember rightly. And I think he commented afterwards saying something like, wow, that was something else, or something like that. I don't remember a great deal. I remember a boot flying over and landing near my feet. Of course, I couldn't help thinking, oh, they don't like the extra guitarist. But I think it worked really, really well with, you know, the five of us. Even though, you know, it didn't really matter whether I was there or not, but as a fact, I was. But even if you think that Pete and Jason's guitars were enough, and they were enough, somehow I did manage to fit in somehow.
Well, this is a question I slightly hesitate to ask, but from a fan's perspective, and nothing to do with you or your playing, did they need another guitarist?
Nah, not at all.
Because I listened to all of those dozens of shows we've had recorded from the years up to that point, and the sound's so incredibly thick already.
Yeah.
That I'm a bit puzzled really as to why they thought it was necessary. Having said that, there's some nice little touches you can hear. I mean, I think there are some, when I listen to some of the things like some of the really full-on ones, like the roller coaster stuff, I can hear there's a bit of extra thickness going on there, but it's not necessarily adding much that wasn't there before. But I think on some of the things like Walking with Jesus, like when they used to do that, when you used to do that, Walking with Jesus, I Believe It segue, there's that extra little layer of that shimmering sound again. I think that thing that you do so well, it really does add a little extra atmosphere to it. So yeah, it's interesting. There is stuff that's worth adding, and I'm glad that we got the chance to experience it. But it does strike me still as an odd thing for them to have decided to do at all in the first place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've asked myself the same question for over 30 years.
So when you played that gig at Reading, no one was under the impression that there wouldn't be any more live shows?
No, it was we were just thinking, great, America next. Going back to the sound of like all the guitars, it did mean that it freed us up to do stuff like Lord Can You Hear Me, whereas I would do that like arpeggio, and Jason would do something else, and then Pete would do the stonking chords in the chorus. That's where for me it was like, oh yeah, this is, they have their defined spaces, you know, and I think it could have developed. That aspect of Spacemen 3 with the extra guitar could have developed in that way, but you know, we never know.
Well, those songs that Jason, in the studio versions, when Jason's doing, on the one hand, he's picking things out and playing his melodies, and on the same time he's doing the wah-wah underneath.
Yeah.
So obviously they had to overdub that when they were doing it in the studio, and so I guess you would give them the chance to do one or the other of those pieces.
Yeah,
and I think your strength seems to be on those picking out the melody lines. Really, that's
one thing I found strange was that whenever you play with a group or whatever, they normally say, oh, it goes like this, goes like that, goes like this. But nobody ever said, in the first rehearsal, we just started playing. Nobody said, oh, it goes like this, it goes like that. Well, they knew me. They knew that I'd seen them dozens of times, and I knew basically what they were playing. And it was just a case of slotting in somehow without swamping everything and just becoming part of it, you know.
So you had no guidance. It was just start playing and see what happens.
The guidance was more sort of, I remember asking Jason in Take Me to the Other Side how many times he did the down, 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 down. And he would say, it's quite specific. I can't remember now exactly, but it was like, each time it was different. It was like dan, 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 you know, very subtle differences that, you know, only somebody would know if they were told it. It was like that, you know. But other than that, there wasn't really a lot of direction except for Pete going, follow my feet.
The impression that people who did little stand-ins with them occasionally would be that, there wasn't so much what to do beforehand, but then Pete would give them a bit of a rundown about what they'd done wrong afterwards, and then they'd have to get it right the next time.
Yeah. Pete was a hard taskmaster. It was more like a kind of, whipping you into shape, really, rather than a specific, like, oh, can you play flattened E minor ninth or whatever? You know, it was nothing like that. It was more of a kind of a feel and a mood.
Well, before we'd done those gigs, let's backtrack a little bit. We haven't talked about the time you spent recording with them, and before recording Spacemen 3 specific things, Pete was working on his Spectrum album.
Oh yeah,
and I know you got to take part in a bit of that.
A couple of tracks at least.
Oh yeah, I did.
I believe you play
Help me, please.
And is that little sort of slidey solo?
Yeah, and there was another one.
Rock and Roll Is Killing My Life, I think.
I think that was it.
Yeah. That would fit very neatly with your style, I think.
But although it was a Pete solo album, he was getting everyone to do little bits on it still. So and that was.
I think that was as a result of Johnny's suggestion again. Saying, why don't you get Mark in to play on your solo album? It sounds quite grand, doesn't it? But they weren't referring to it as a, or were they? I don't know. I think it was more like, Pete's doing an album on his own. Do you want to go and play? You know, yeah. You wouldn't have to ask me twice, you know.
Yeah. Well, Recurring had been started before Reading. It was, I think, in between the some of the live gigs you did. It was first done, and before that, of course, they'd recorded Hypnotized. But I think, is that before you were actually involved in any studio stuff?
I wasn't involved in any of Hypnotised recording.
No, I thought that was a little bit before then. But then, beginning of August, that's when the recording of Recurring starts. I'm under the impression that that no one except for Pete is on Big City.
You're right.
Yeah, I thought that was just a solo work of his.
Yeah. I remember when I was in Pet Shop Boys in Spain, I think, and we were in some club before the gig, and Big City came on, and Chris Lowe leaned over to me and he went, "Is this you?" And I went, "No, it's not me, but it's a guy who was in Spacemen 3. This is Spacemen 3, but I didn't play on this." And he went, "I like this. I like this." Big City's got a lot of people like it, but I don't think they're that aware of Spacemen 3.
I think one of the biggest tragedies of all of the fallout at the end of Spacemen 3 is the length of time between those things being recorded and them coming out. Because if Big City had come out as a single around the time it was made, I think it could have joined like Primal Screams Loaded and Stone Roses Full Gold and The Mondays Wrote for Luck. It could have been part of that indie dance axis.
But I'm glad it's not. It's in its own zone. It stands on its own, and that's why it is what it is. I do agree with you to a certain extent. You know, wouldn't it be great if it was up there or alongside there with all those other acts you mentioned and those particular songs associated with them? But I think it stands in its own right as, you know, its own thing.
I wonder, I mean, when we looking back on it now with so much distance, it doesn't really matter about what eras things come from. You hear them on their own merits. I just feel that coming out in 91, maybe 2 years after its moment, it sounded strangely dated at the time in a way that it doesn't really now, because we know it. It's what it is. And as you say,
I love Big City. It's fantastic.
No, it's
full on.
I think and I'm sure that I'm less likely to have played on many of Pete's tracks the way I know you worked on some of them, but not many of them. But let's go through. Do you do anything on Just to See You Smile?
No.
I thought because since the first versions of that were done at the same,
that was a B-side of Hypnotised, wasn't it?
Double A side.
I'm sorry. Edit that out.
Careful to split the credits equally there. But yes, it was done earlier, so I was assuming that it probably weren't anything to do with that. I know that Will certainly played on "I Love You." Any guitar bits on that one?
Yeah. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah. Played on that. Yeah.
I mean, that's another one which seemed to be a prime candidate if there was any chance of a crossover into a more mainstream audience. And I love Will's playing on that. He does this really clever thing where every verse, it gets a little bit more intricate than it was previously.
Yeah.
And I'm not a musician, so I don't know what the terms for this are, but the sound on the bass is like you get on some reggae things, you can tell how loud it is. Because when you're plucking the strings, it's got that sound, a little like a drop of water. Hitting the thing. And,
it's almost like those I don't know who played the bass on Je T'aime or whatever. It's that trebly picked, reverbed bass, but you know it's a bass. I know what you mean.
But anyway, shouldn't be talking about the others. This is your contribution. So you were doing the sort of strumming along parts on that one.
Yeah, like a rhythm guitar. I mean,
I think it's lovely. That's one of my favourite later day.
Were you there when Pat did his little flute bit at the end, which he said he was made to do umpteen times, much to his frustration?
No, I wasn't there for that, unfortunately, or fortunately, maybe.
It's so perfectly placed, that bit of flute at the end. I think just finishes it off as such a lovely little flourish.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
It was Pat Fish, was it?
It was.
I think, yes.
I mean, I knew that, but when I think about it, it's like Pat playing the flute. I can't get my head around that. Yeah. But he's great, yeah.
Set Me Free, I've Got the Key.
That's a hell of a tune.
That sounds like it's driven by a bit of your...
I did a solo in that.
Yeah.
Which I'm not...
Oh, that's lovely, that solo. You've got a kind of... I don't know what effect you've put on that guitar. It's just amazing sound on that.
I think that was probably... That might have been Paul putting the effect on, the engineer, Paul Atkins.
It's just so piercing that particular sound, I always thought.
Is there just the one solo in that song?
This is the big one towards the end, certainly.
Yeah, is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah.
And there's the big kind of crashing drum at the end for the kind of final round.
Yeah.
On the vinyl, that's all of Pete's side, but we'll come back to some extra bits they threw in later on Jason's side, which I imagine was a bit more of a band feel to it. Feel So Sad, which starts off just as a little excerpt, but then there's a longer version of it later on as well.
Yeah.
Of course, one that you got to revisit a bit later on as well.
Yeah. I played on that. Yeah, I'm sure I did. Has it got those little...
Yeah, and the way that it on the CD version of Recurring as well, the way that it's mixed in with Drive, and there's lots of little picking bits. Going over that.
That's
of course,
right,
that was just an instrumental when it was put out on the single, but you know, it feels just it's a big part of Feel So Sad on the album version.
Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of nicely woozy, longer extended ones. I mean, there's sometimes a rehearsal version of that sort of goes on for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it started off on the Recurring, of course, but I think you were still doing that rehearsal.
Yeah, we did,
afterwards.
In that school hall, yeah. I don't think I played on that, on Recurring.
How about on Feeling Just Fine?
No, I don't think I played on that either.
Well, certainly it carried on in the early days of Spiritualized.
Yeah, we did that. Yeah.
You know, about half the early set was recurring things.
Yeah.
I think this is the point where I have to hand over to Mark.
I had quite a moment during Feeling Just Fine, which I always thought was one of the most underrated Spacemen tracks. Even now, when I listen to it, I still think it sounds incredible. But anyway, moving forward, I saw pretty much every early Spiritualized gig in London. Every time you played in London, I was there. From the one at the Marquee, I think was the first one that I saw. And there was one you did at the Mean Fiddler, November 91.
I remember that,
And I will never forget it, my God. And you played Feeling Just Fine. And I was, in a slightly altered state, quite a bit of beer that night. And as you built it up, there was a point where I just thought, something's going to happen here. And Jason built up the guitar. He kind of backed him up and everything. Kate's keyboard sounded fantastic. And suddenly I was in this area, which I now describe as feeling like I was sitting in God's lap. It's easily the most incredible musical moment of my life. And I remember thinking, this is the end of the road. There's nowhere for me to go now. There's music can go nowhere from here. I've actually seen musical perfection for the first time in my life. And I thought I could just die now. And it really wouldn't matter and everything. And then gradually the music kind of started to calm down. And you used to do that song in 2 sections. And I remember standing there thinking, what the hell just happened there? And then the music started to build up, and Jason had this incredible way of playing wah-wah then. It sounded like a kind of oscilloscope, just kind of wobbling all over the place. And he built it up, and I suddenly thought, my God, they're going to do it again. And bingo, there I was, back in God's lap, musical perfection for the second time in 5 minutes. And it was, at the end of it, I had to go and sit down. It was like, I'd never experienced anything like that in my entire life. And it was... yeah, it was something else. I've got some recordings from that show which do kind of show what was going on. But, you know, I remember saying to people the next day, I witnessed something that I don't think I will ever experience ever again. But all the Spiritualized gigs were just astonishing. All the ones I saw you play. There were a couple on the Pure Phase tour, which Ian was at one, which was spectacular. I mean, you were gone by that point, but they were still a great band, but it wasn't quite the same. I think that lineup that you were in, well, for me, that was probably the greatest period of music that I can remember. But it was that gig, November 91, up at the Mean Fiddler. So I owe you for that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark.
It was wonderful moment.
Fantastic.
No, it's giving me tingles thinking about it. Christ.
Was that with, I don't know if you remember which guitar I had. Was that the Gretsch?
Oh, God. I can't. I think you did play a Gretsch quite a lot back then.
Yeah.
At those, but
just I remember I used to get a lot of controlled feedback from that.
Well, whatever it was unforgettable. And despite the state I was in, I can remember that moment vividly. Just Christ Almighty, you know, the end of the road.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
Pleasure.
I feel like I'm ruining the mood now, going back to some rather boring Spacemen 3 questions again. But let's finish off recurring. Do you play anything on Billy Whiz Blue One?
I don't think I do.
Some bit surprising way, because it's a bit more bluesy, and there seems some bits which could be natural places for yourself. But oh well, not about that.
Yeah.
I do know that one thing that wasn't on the original vinyl album, but just seems like a central part of recurring for those of us who just lived with the CD all the time. The bit that bridges the two sides is your cover of When Tomorrow Hits. Will remembers that being an attempt, despite the bad feeling that was going on at the time, to actually try and do a sort of live in the studio version to get everyone together to do it.
I think they'd already done the basis of the live track, and Pete asked me to do this meandering slide part over the middle bit of it, and I just couldn't do it. I don't know why, I just couldn't do it. And then Pete, he came out, he said, let me have a go. And I thought, I gave him the guitar, and I thought he would put the guitar on, but he just put the guitar in the stand, and he just let the slide just meander over the strings, and it was just fantastic. He did it in one take, nailed it.
Wow! So that presumably is the bit that runs through it. The sort of...
That's it. Yeah, that's it. That's Pete with just doing that. Yeah, on my guitar on the stand, and I did this little at the very end on the tail out, this little other slide line, I think.
Well, if that's an overdub rather than being done with the band, it fits incredibly well, because it's like a call and response thing. The slidey bit, your bit is presumably the
yeah, that's it.
But then in the background, it's
yeah.
Well, it fits in brilliantly.
Was that not on the original vinyl then?
No, it's very difficult to know what is recurring, really, because when it came out, it was that era when bands were putting out very different CD versions, usually like a few extra tracks. And in the case of recurring, because of the slightly strange two sides thing where all the songs were split up, it meant that the extra tracks weren't stuck on the end of the CD, they were spread out throughout it. So when we talked about Pete's tracks, but we didn't talk about some of the ones that only appeared on that CD, like Why Couldn't I See? I gather he did that largely himself with Richard Formby after
I played on that.
Oh, you did play on that, right?
Yeah. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah, I was I wasn't trying to copy it, but in Strawberry Fields Forever there's this piano line, I think. Ding, 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 ding. And I was just using those notes, but not copying Strawberry Fields Forever, but using those same notes. Dun, 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 dun. Ding, ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding. You know.
Wow.
Yeah, that was me.
Lovely sort of chiming solo bit.
And then I think Richard played after that. I'm not sure I can't remember musically what he did, but remember what I did.
Well, a lot of those songs went through a very long gestation period anyway, so it's hard to know quite that. So yeah, that wasn't on the vinyl, but it's on the CD. There's another version of Just to See You Smile as well. Yeah, the When Tomorrow Hits is only on the CD as well. Although, to make it more complicated, there was a separate German pressing, and that's got
wasn't it?
that's got those tracks on as well. But it's only collectors like us who have to care about that. And there's another version of Feeling Just Fine on the CD as well.
Yeah.
Although it's described as an alternate mix, I think you'd have to be incredibly astute of hearing to hear in what way it's any different from.
There is a difference. I have this argument with people a lot of the time. I can tell the difference. There's a kind of added bit of drum sound in the second one. Having said that, they are incredibly similar. I don't mind. You could put a third version of that track on that album. I wouldn't care. I love that song so much.
So yeah, lots of delays after all that was recorded, and of course by the time that the album finally came out, everything had changed anyway, because Spacemen 3 not really able to continue in the form that they were, and Will had already left earlier in the year, and then there was that fairly unpleasant meeting in November when after which yourself and Johnny really regarded everything to be over anyway. But then a few months later, that's when Jason was thinking of getting some stuff together so that he could get back out and doing things.
Mm.
And although there was a perception from some people that he sort of took the band away, really the band didn't exist anymore at that point.
No.
So when he was getting things together, it seemed only natural to go for the people he knew he could work with.
Yeah. I mean, at that meeting, when I got up and left, and it wasn't the best meeting, I looked to Jason and I went, give us a ring, you know, if you ever want to do anything.
And then it happened.
Yeah. And then I fully accept, actually, I didn't expect that he would ring. I thought that was it. That's over. And, but then Jace called me. I can't remember how long it was.
Well, I think it was in the February of 1990 that things were starting to go together. So it's only, 3 months or so.
Yeah.
Between there. So first of all, it was just to record a version of Any Way That You Want Me.
Yeah.
Was there a feeling from the very beginning that there was a lot of stuff in place and that there was an album to be made?
No, not really. But we knew that potentially, there was this big impetus of feeling that, Jason and the rest of us were somehow not being able to express our full musical intentions in Spacemen 3. So what became Spiritualized was obviously that vehicle for all that, impetus and drive. But I'm beginning to think now, if there was this idea to have this band at the same time as Spacemen 3 was still going, or have I got that wrong?
Jason was saying in public that was the plan. Even up to the time when Spiritualized started gigging, and so obviously nothing could be kept under wraps anymore. Everything was out in the open. Even when that was happening, he was doing interviews with the music press saying, well, there's going to be another Spacemen 3 album out next year, and we might do another tour. So in public, at least, that certainly was the plan. And maybe that's the way he'd been discussing it with you guys.
Yeah.
But going from what else had been happening between him and Pete and the general situation around that, I'd be a little surprised if he really meant it. I think he might just been trying to be diplomatic and not want to get into a big slanging match in public. I mean, obviously it happened eventually, but at that point it could still have been headed off perhaps. So whether he was just trying to gloss things over to make it feel a little more pleasant, I think the chances of Spacemen 3 actually carrying on were probably pretty non-existent by that point.
We were contributing to music, which was going to be the next Spacemen album. But to the best of my knowledge, I only played on one track, and it was this thing called Zoink, which was basically Pete's Fox repeater, just going, I. And that's when I put the original Sway guitar line down. And then Jason put some more bluesy sort of guitars on it. And we didn't know what was going to happen to it. But when in the fallout of Spacemen 3 finishing and the nascent Spiritualized starting, we both thought, let's go and get our guitar parts and copy them from that Zoink track. We'll put it onto another tape, and then we'll erase it from Zoink, which is what we did. Bit harsh at the time, I suppose, but that's what happened.
If you'd written the part, it's yours to do what you want with it, really, isn't it? Yes. I gather that the recording for Laser Guided Melodies was really done moderately quickly, and it was just Jason playing with it for a long time afterwards that meant it didn't come out for a bit.
Yeah, well, we had this guy called Ed Buller, who was, I think he mixed Feel So Sad and the Run single. But when it came to the album, Ed, I think, compiled with Jason a version of the album. And after listening to it a few times, it just didn't sound right. I remember Jason played me Take Your Time, and my guitars were just ridiculously loud. And for a song like that, you don't need loud guitars. You need them to sit, properly. And I just turned around to Jason. I went, my guitars are a bit loud in this, Jace. And his face was like an Easter Island statue. And he knew I was right. and that's when he decided he was going to start from scratch and mix it all again. And he went with this guy called Barry Clemson, and between the two of them, they knitted it together. Why Don't You Smile and Sway, they were recorded in this barn studio in Wellingborough, near Wellingborough in Northamptonshire. And that wasn't with Ed at all. So it was only a few tracks that there must have been a version of Laser Guided Melodies without Sway and Why Don't You Smile? Oh, Why Don't You Smile's not on
It's not on the album. No. The version of Sway is the same.
Yeah, because that definitely wasn't done with Ed.
Right.
It was done with this guy called Robert John Godfrey.
Robert John Godfrey of the Enid.
Yeah, the very same.
So that's recording of Laser Guided Melodies, and then you've already talked a little bit with Mark about some of the live experiences for them. But what's your memories of the early tours? I know the very first one was very different from how it turned out, because in the very early ones you were all playing, I think, so quietly. It was not what people were expecting.
There was there's Neil, who used to drive us, Neil Bradshaw, on that very first tour. He used to video the gigs, and I've never seen them actually, but he must have a cache of video footage of those first gigs. But at the very first Spiritualized gig was at Glasgow King Tut's.
King Tut's, yeah.
And that's it. And in between one of the songs, there's this Scottish voice goes, because it's so quiet, "Should have brought my grandmother." Oh, it's funny.
I remember the gig at the Marquee being so quiet. I remember sitting upstairs and being able to talk during the music without it actually getting in the way, because it was all so pleasant and lovely. And then I saw another one at London School of Economics where I think there was a cello player, and it was so laid back. There was a guy that was with her. I remember at one point he yelled out, "More laid back, please," like this, because it was just so quiet. And I told a friend of mine about this beautiful band that was just the loveliest music. You're going to come along, and you played a Ulu completely wrong. Suddenly the noise pedal had been well and truly stepped on, and it was just a cacophony of wah wah and everything else. It was, but there was a change, I think, after that first tour, certainly in terms of volume and intensity.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I don't know how conscious that was. It was obviously we were being driven by Jason's like overall vision, but I don't think he actually said, "I want it to be nice and quiet and laid back." It's just the way we did it. We didn't tend to vocalize a lot of stuff. We would just play, and whatever was right was, that's how we did it. And I think it was probably a subconscious reaction to the sonic onslaught of Spacemen, which Jason in particular had been doing for years, and this was like something to counterbalance that whole, but you're right, there was a shift in our the way we played live in volume. Was it from that Ulu gig?
Yeah, the Ulu gig, it really did take me by surprise. But that was one I thought that was an outstanding show, that one. But they were all those early gigs were great. There was some few more of your songs in that. Things like Harmony used to be played quite a bit. I used to love that.
Not called Harmony at the time, I seem to remember, but yeah, it was certainly one of your compositions, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. How did that come about? That was just it was almost like a finger picking exercise. And
great little tune.
I played it to Jason, or I might have suggested it in a rehearsal or something, and we all just played along with it. And I'd called it Colleen because it kind of had a vaguely Irishy sort of sound to it. And Jason went, no, don't call it that. Call it Girl. And I went, that's great, because there's also a Suicide song called Girl. That chimes much better with what we were about. And I think Jason put some lyrics to it. And we might have even done we did do a recording of it. Me and him did a demo of it in this studio in Northampton. But it just didn't come to anything. And
it's a shame that never got an official release. Well, until later, of course, but
yeah, it was. But my version of it, Harmony and the Spiritualized Girls, you know, they were two completely different songs. Superficially, they've got the same guitar, you know, but they're, as I said, they were two completely different songs. But you're not missing much by not hearing the demo we did, because it wasn't realized at all. It was there wasn't a good feeling in this demo studio we were at either. It just didn't gel, didn't work.
Well, not heard that demo, of course, but from the live versions, it does sound like the Spiritualized ones, just a little pacier.
Yeah.
Whereas by the time you recorded it for the first Slipstream album, it's got that much more nicely laid back feel to it as well.
Yeah.
It just fit into that kind of slightly bouncy section of the Spiritualized songs like Run, you know, which had that kind of bouncy rumble to it. It was fitted perfectly.
I mean, so we've talked about your guitar line in Sway, this song, which didn't end up making it in the end. No other opportunities, it seems, at the time to contribute too much to the writing, which is obviously the way that things ended up going in different directions. But although you'd left Spiritualized by the time it came out, you do play on pretty much all of Pure Phase as well, though.
Yeah.
Well, yourself and Johnny play on pretty much all of
Pure Phase. I remembered something the other day that I'd completely forgotten about. Jason and Kate had come over to Northampton. This was in the early days of Spiritualized, and we were all in a good frame of mind. You know, we were confident about the future and all that. And Jason said that he wanted to do songwriting with me. And I went, you what? And he went, yeah, you know, can we do a kind of like a songwriting partnership, whatever, you know? And I went, yeah, all right. But I didn't think anything of it at all. And I went around his house a couple of times in Rugby to work on stuff, and it just never really gelled. And I'm a great believer in, I don't believe in forcing something to happen when, if it's not happening naturally, then, and it just kind of like fizzled out, the notion that me and him were going to be like Pierce Refoy, like it was Kemba Pierce, you know. And I didn't even think at the time that it was going to be like that anyway. But when we tried, you know, having a go at it in his flat, we would, you know, go into the little adjoining room where we had all our gear, and he would run through a couple of like very simple, basic stuff, and I just would struggle to come up with something, and then we'd just go and have a few more beers, and it would that didn't, it never really came off the ground, but it didn't matter, you know.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that chat as well. Sorry, it doesn't end in an elegant way either. We'd all been chatting at this point for the best part of 2 hours, and I think we were all slightly winding down a bit, and hadn't even decided at that point whether we were going to carry on or not. Since there's so much of Mark's solo material, I thought it would have been very unfair to try and squeeze it in to what time we had left. So
we've been kind of speculating on that songwriting partnership. If that had worked, it could have been very interesting. I mean, Sway was obviously the kind of peak of that relationship between them, and which is well, certainly one of my favorite Spiritualized songs. But one does wonder.
It could have been really intriguing, couldn't it? Because I mean, obviously, we all know very thoroughly what Jason's compositions are, and especially the ones around that time, which I think we're particularly interested in. And the two of us have been returning recently to listen to a lot of Mark's output, and there's some wonderful songwriting stuff in there. I'm really looking forward to us talking about that sometime soon.
But it also makes you go straight back to the era of Spiritualized that he was in, and I'm quite happy to admit that quite a lot of the guitar parts I thought Jason was playing were actually played by Mark, and I think that his impact and input in that band is probably not as respected as it ought to be. I think that he played a far bigger part than people realize, and I've certainly come to realize that now.
I think you could be right. So as a result of that, of us having enjoyed so much of their respective works, it's just a shame that it didn't work out together. But you know, like Mark was saying himself at the end of the interview, sometimes it just doesn't, no obvious reason. And if that's the way it didn't work out, then as he says, you don't want to force it.
That's right.
Eric Morse talks in his book about a time when Pete Kember and Mark tried composing together. And again, he says it was a similar sort of thing. You know, had a try, didn't quite work out.
Sometimes it works, I guess. It's interesting. One of the gigs which we talked about, I'll chuck in a small anecdote here, which was the LSE gig, which was incredibly laid back with a cellist playing. And I went on, well, one of the people who decided that they were going to go to this gig was somebody that I knew who had a interesting background or just interesting interests in various narcotics. And he'd been to see Spacemen 3 at Hammersmith Riverside a few years before, which I'd been to. And to my amazement, he decided that he was going to go around the crowd and offer free tabs of acid to anybody who felt like they wanted to really elevate themselves that night. Quite a few different reactions. Some people looked slightly alarmed that somebody was giving out free drugs like this at such a show, but other people took it. I think there were probably half a dozen. So I'm sure that contributed to a slightly surreal atmosphere that night. And roll forward a couple of years, this same guy decided to come along to this Spiritualized gig. He expected a full-blown Spacemen 3 noise fest, and so decided that he was going to eat an entire gram of speed before the set commenced, and then sat in his seat, chomping and gnashing his teeth throughout the whole thing, desperate for something to get going, which of course nothing did. And I remember at the end him looking desperate for some kind of outlet for whatever energy he had inside him, whereupon I think I decided that I was going to leave them there and go home. But yeah, interesting people at some of those shows.
Well, one of the things that Mark talks about in that interview, that story of him being a bit nervous and Pete Kember saying, "Don't worry, you'll be rocking with your cock out," and Mark having told some of his friends this and then having it shouted back at him from the audience at one of the gigs. I think I found that on the live recording. Have a listen, see what you think.
Thank you.
Now, I sent that to Mark and he's not convinced, but
I reckon you found it, Ian.
I think it is, yes. Recorded for posterity. There's a video recording of Mark's gig at the Subterranea with Spacemen 3. I think we mentioned this during the interview, and that's all on YouTube, so I'll put some links to that. It's not the clearest recording, although I think the one that's on YouTube is probably about as good as we're going to get. Many of us who've been fans for a little while will have had a copy of a VHS that was doing the rounds in the 90s. And in the way that when these things were copied and then you'd make a copy for your mates who then make a copy for their mates, it's not the sort of recording that gig that survives very well. And I'm pretty sure that the copy I had, it was pretty much like watching a blue screen for the entire duration of it. Sounds pretty clear. But the copy that's on YouTube is not bad, and you can definitely see the angle it's recorded from is quite convenient if you want to see some evidence that Mark was in Spacemen 3, because you can see him and Jason quite clearly throughout it.
I think this raises the big question, which still mystifies me, is why there is no proper professional footage of Spacemen 3 live anywhere. Or do you think that even though they weren't particularly big, almost any band from that era, you will find decent quality clips, but not of the Spacemen?
Yes, unfortunately, there's very little to go on, isn't there? And we've got that Subterranea gig, unfortunately, very poor quality. There's a couple from the 1989 European tour. There's
a German one, isn't there?
There's one from the Enger Forum in Enger in Germany, and that's pretty good.
Is that the one filmed over Jason's shoulder?
Yes, so it's almost all on Pete, and there's some good shots of Johnny drumming as well.
That's right.
Enduring Suicide.
I know, he's giving it loads, isn't he?
Marathon session he put in. My dad always used to say my dad wasn't a big music fan, but whenever you'd see things on TV, he'd always say, look at the drummer, they're the one that's working the hardest. And if you don't come away from watching that Enger footage thinking that that's true about Johnny, then
he's just left on his own at one point, just carrying the beat, just with a kind of bit of noise around it, but he's holding it all together.
Well, there's that great story from the New Morning gig on that tour. I think it's that one where they play a very long Suicide and realize that there are some people who didn't really come for Spacemen 3 who are in the venue who are looking annoyed, and so Kemba says to all of them, let's go back on and do it again.
Yeah.
But when he said that to the band and they've all agreed, Johnny's still out there drumming. And he doesn't come back for another few minutes, having worked so hard, obviously being really knackered. And Pete says to him, oh, we're going to go back and do it again. And Johnny, in the way that he seems to be very famous for, just smiled and agreed and straight back out there. He seems to
does it.
Yeah. It's good that we've got that video evidence of Mark, because there appear to be no photographs of his time in Spacemen 3, unless you count a couple of audience shots from the Reading Festival, which is so indistinct that you can barely make anything out. I mean, of course, he was only in the band for a very short time, and that wasn't a time when there were any UK music press interviews going on. But Mark does have a memory of... I think it was backstage at Reading or around that time, of having some professional photos taken by a French photographer. Whether it was for a French magazine or not, we're not sure. But no evidence of them has ever emerged. If anyone's aware of those ever having been printed anywhere,
I'd love to see those.
It would be great to see them, wouldn't it? Yeah. I did once get in touch with Les Imroch, the big famous French music magazine, to see if it was anything to do with them. And they replied in a way that suggested they had no idea what I was on about. So maybe it wasn't them after all. So many thanks once again to Mark, and we look forward to hearing about the stuff that's happened since the Spiritualized days with him next time. Well, as that part of the interview was a little bit shorter than the one we had previously, we thought we could fill some time with a little bit of song discussion, and tying it into the things that Mark was involved with during Spacemen 3. We thought we would talk about I Love You, one of Pete Kember's tracks from Recurring. So we're in an era here where whichever Spacemen 3 track you choose, you're going to be choosing from one or the other of the main guys, because they weren't really working together at this point. But I Love You seems a good choice because Mark was telling us during the interview about his playing on it. It seems pretty clear that there's a bass line of wheels going through. Of course, I can never be very sure about any of this without talking to the people involved, because a lot of people were multi-instrumentalists. It could have been other people playing it. But
sounds like Mark's guitar style, though, doesn't it?
You can
really pick that out now.
And the bass, when it's very high-pitched bass playing, but it sounds like the inventiveness that I would expect from Will.
It does.
So, well, Mark, what's your general impressions of this one?
Well, this is one of my favourite tracks on Recurring. It's an obvious one to kind of pick out. I think that I remember the NME describing Pete's side of Recurring, or the last two tracks, as being pure pop, and that's really the way that I look at it. I love the kind of there's a little kind of tip of the hat to the Trogs in that guitar riff. I love the whole kind of 60s motif in it. The little bit of flute at the end is the little kind of sort of 60s signature, but it's still got Pete's sort of trademark wobbly keyboard. It's kind of Pete Kember personified from that particular era, I think. And when you compare it with the remix, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more, even though they are the same set of recordings, they're almost two different songs. That the difference is fairly stark. I think also the fact that Pete, for reasons which I'm still not completely clear, suddenly introduces a Jan and Dean Coca-Cola commercial called Swing the Jingle. Not even played in particular, so the beats match or anything. It just appears when Pete's talking about listening to the radio. I know he's a big Jan and Dean fan and that particular era of music. This just adds to the whole kind of 60s vibe of it for me. I think that when he includes the little bit of Pat Fish playing flute at the end, I think it's almost just to say to you, if you weren't sure that this is meant to sound a bit 60s-ish, I'll just pop this in at the end. And I think that we touched on this before. I think that Pat Fish was driven semi-insane with the amount of takes that Pete demanded he do for that. It only goes on for about 40 seconds or something, but it's a beautiful little piece of flute at the end.
It is absolutely wonderful. I mean, Pat was saying that at the time, Pete didn't really know what it was he wanted. He just knew what he didn't want. And so when a take wasn't quite the way that he wanted it, it would have to be another one. But, well, Pat, I'm sorry that if you had to suffer a little bit for that session. From our point of view, I think it was worth it.
It was worth it.
Absolutely fantastic there.
One of the interesting things about doing all the repeated takes is that when I spoke to Pete a few years ago, and I did a big interview with him for Soul Kiss, and he was talking about the classical musicians that they used, and they got these professional orchestra musicians to come in, and he handed out the music and said everything, and they kind of tuned up. They practiced a little bit, did it, and they said, right, we're ready. And he said, no, I've done it. I've actually recorded it all. They were going, well, we're just ready to go. And he said, no, I've already actually got where I wanted when you did that little run through. And what he wanted was the spontaneity, the kind of innocence of everything. He didn't want something that was done so many times that you lost the soul of what he was trying to do. I found that very interesting. And saying that to particularly my parents, who are very much classical music people, and they said that they'd never heard of anybody in pop music working like that. But obviously, rewind to the recording sessions, he wasn't having any of that. I think he knew that he could, if he kept on at Pat would eventually come up with the goods, and he sure did.
Yeah, so I've got to try very hard not to get diverted onto Soul Kiss, because that would be a discussion that I just wouldn't want to finish, really. I think it's absolutely phenomenal. I think I Love You is just all the interviews that Pete had been doing around the time of Recurring, or indeed around the time of his Spectrum solo album, made a big point about the fact that he was using some of the more downbeat songs on the solo album because he was trying to save all his more positive stuff for the next Spacemen 3 one. And this really is the epitome of that upbeat, summery, bouncy pop song. It really is that close. You know, we talked in the interview with Mark about how there would have been a potential for Big City to have been a bit of a hit and a crossover had it come out a little earlier, and this would have been an obvious follow-up, really. I remember Jason saying around the time, while the two of them were not really saying many nice things about each other, and one of the things that Jason was saying, I think, was that he wasn't very happy with the choice of Big City as a single, and when asked, well, what would be a single then, in one of the interviews, he said, well, I suppose Pete's I Love You would be the one. So he would have been, I don't know about happy, but understanding if it had been something that had been released in that way, which might explain why there was a remix prepared.
Yeah, the remix is absolutely beautiful. I remember at the time Pete had he'd had 50 copies. Well, there were 50 test pressings made up, weren't there? Mm-hmm. And that, I think, was when Jason put his foot down and insisted that the remix for Drive went on instead. And I think that the relationship wasn't particularly great, as we all know. So Jason had his way. The idea of it being a double A-side for Pete Kember was obviously not going to be particularly popular with Jason. So that version of I Love You vanished for a number of years. Eventually came out on the the DJ Tones 12-inch that
I
came
think that's
out.
where it got its official release. The first time that us mere mortals who couldn't track down one of those test pressings got to hear it, I think was on bootleg 7-inch.
That's
came
correct.
Out in the mid-90s. Yeah. So that was, I think that's the first time I got to hear it.
But there was one shop in Birmingham who I think Pete sold all those copies to. Mm-hmm. And when I was running Runcible Records, I got wind of this and rang them up, and throughout the next 2 days rang them up pretending to be various other people and basically bought every copy that they'd sell me. And I think we had about a dozen at one point. We had big database of Spacemen customers, and people were very happy. But I mean, that fetches a pretty penny these days, doesn't it? I mean, you probably wouldn't get changed for 300 quid for one of those, do you think?
I don't think they come up. Can't remember the last time one actually came up for sale. I think that sounds about right. Strangely, although I do think of myself as a bit of a collector of Spacemen 3 stuff, I'm sort of quite happy just to be able to hear it, really.
Yeah,
I think I wouldn't, not too fussed about having one, but for those people who there was a discussion about this on one of the Spacemen 3 Facebook groups recently, and people started producing their copies and showing pictures of them. And I think the guy who started the thread had 2 copies. I think you might have 2 copies, Mark. So although there are 50 of them out there, there may not be 50 people that own them. So it's an interesting remix. It's almost like rather than having been completely reworked, I think it is the same basic track, and it seems to have less on it than the album version. So the bass line seems to not be there. Some of the guitar work, I think probably Mark's guitar work, is not there, but it gives it a whole different atmosphere. Suddenly
it gives it more of a Spectrum vibe, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? Because when you listen to the album version, it feels like a 3-chord structure, but that's not there on all the instrumentation, and with bits of it taken away, suddenly it becomes much more of a drone, a 1-chord thing, and it shifts the feel a bit. Still very nice and bouncy. The thing I love about the bass line, particularly on the real version, is it seems to have been thought through really cleverly, in the first verse it's largely based around 2 notes. It just sort of goes dum 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 dum, and then the next verse is a little bit more going on, and in the next one, by that point it's quite prosaic. It's wandering all over the place. So for something which has just got this underlying drone that keeps it steady, there's that going on to make it develop a bit and go places too. It later transpired, of course, that part of the influence of this track was some Bob Marley, which Pete was completely open about when people were asking about it. There's
Duppy
the music.
Conqueror.
Yeah, Duppy Conqueror is where some of the lyrics were taken from. And Mr. Brown, I think, is the general musical feel of the whole thing. But doesn't that just completely fit in with the that sort of laid-back, summery feel that Pete was aiming for then?
It also tunes right into Pete's Lee Perry obsession, because that was, of course, the era where Bob Marley worked with Lee Perry. And Pete being a huge fan of Lee Scratch Perry, I think that, well, there you are. That was it bubbling to the surface.
Yeah, I wouldn't like to say for sure until we've spoken to more people involved, because on a lot of those later recordings, say with the multi-instrumentalists, you can never be sure quite who's playing what. And with the drum machines sounding, I mean, so much of the drums on Playing with Fire are drum machines, even though some of it sounds, incredibly powerful. So I think on I Love You, I think there's an underlying
yeah,
and I think that's programmed.
Yeah.
I think there might be some real stuff on there as well. So if that is right and Johnny's playing on it as well, then it might be one of the closest band performances that we've got on that side of the album as well.
Yeah.
Never played live, unfortunately, and in fact, I'm not even aware of Pete having played it subsequently. He's gone back and revisited a lot of his Spacemen and early Spectrum work, especially on some of the recent tours. But I'm quite prepared to admit that I've just forgotten about this one, but it doesn't ring a bell with me.
I can't recall a time that he's played it live.
No. So if you're taking requests, Pete, for your forthcoming tour, that's something that we haven't enjoyed previously and would love to, I think, again.
I'll vote for that one.
Well, we hope to be back before too much longer with a final part of our chat with Mark. Until then, we've been Spaceman Pod. Thanks for coming.
Goodbye.